good evening. Three words, Joyce Carol Oates, Leïla Slimani, and Joumana Khatib from the New York Times. Thank you very much, and thank you for being with us.
Welcome, everybody. Let's see. Sorry, can somebody show me? Oh, okay, very good. Okay. Welcome, everybody, and thank you for waiting. It's a pleasure to have you all in the room, and such a pleasure to be up here with Leïla and Joyce, both of, two of the most fearless writers who are working now. So thank you both for being here. Anyway, Gaëtan, maybe do you have a quick introduction about Leïla and Joyce, or can we assume that everybody in the room knows them very well at this point? Okay.
Give room for the discussion.
Fair enough. So, Joyce, we'll catch you up briefly. Leïla and I were talking for a bit earlier, and Leïla said something quite provocative to me, which is that she thinks that we are in the midst of a crisis of imagination. Leïla, am I capturing that correctly? Okay, fair enough. And so, Joyce, I wondered, do you have any immediate thoughts about whether the American people or writers are in a crisis of imagination?
Well, I suppose it depends upon about whom you're speaking, because there are many kinds of writers. You're probably thinking of autofiction. But there are other writers. I mean, there are many other writers in completely different genres, different fields. That's just a very small sliver. And probably not the most popular, in terms of just of book sales. I mean, there's always a Stephen King who's extreme. He makes everything up. I want to thank you all for waiting for me. I must say, I didn't actually think I would ever get here. The New Jersey Turnpike.
I would have waited for you for many hours. Yeah.
It's an interesting point, though, because I don't know, Joyce, you've been actually quite outspoken on the subject of autofiction since you brought it up. And I wondered, do you have feelings about whether autofictional works are less interesting or perhaps less rigorous or should be evaluated against some really deeply imaginative work, for example?
Well, if we look at the 20th century, for instance, and actually throughout all of literary history, there's always been a strain between the what we call autobiographical or confessional fiction, which is maybe the first impulse of writers when they're quite young to write about themselves, and poets also. So that's the whole strand of fiction. But then there's the very imaginative and adventurous other strand, Homer, for instance, Shakespeare, Dostoevsky, people who are writing with a very vast landscape and a different kind of attitude toward what literature is. But as I said, when we come to the 20th century, then there's some really excellent, exciting work that's almost purely autobiographical, like James Joyce's work. It's extremely autobiographical, not to mention Proust and John Updike, William Butler Yeats. The so-called confessional poets like Anne Sexton and Sylvia Plath, writing exclusively about themselves, but writing very well. But I don't think that's the only, that's not the only strand. There's Faulkner is making things up, and Hemingway and many other writers. So I think if you just look at a little sliver, you can deduce something erroneous because it's such a small sampling.
Yeah, I think it's more that people, like in France, are very obsessed by true stories. And, you see so much movies inspired by a true story. And I remember when I presented one day my book, The Perfect Nanny, which is a book about a nanny who kills the children. The first question of the audience was a guy asking me, "Do you have children and are they alive?" And I was like, you can write a story with dead children that are not yours. And I was quite shocked and surprised by the fact that this very young guy couldn't imagine that I wrote a book of fiction and that it has nothing to do with me. So this crisis of imagination that I told you about, it's more about the fact that people sometimes don't imagine that everything comes from just your mind, your imagination, and that sometimes it has nothing to do with you directly. Of course, maybe it has to do with your souvenir or something that is very, very profound in you, very dark, but it's not really related in terms of a true story. And the thing is that I don't really think that true stories exist. I don't really believe in true stories. If someone says it is a true story, but what is a true story?
Well, again, it's a somewhat small sampling because this person may have asked you a naive question. We all get naive questions, but there may be many more readers who would never ask a question like that. and I think that as far as true stories go, it's sort of like a spectrum. There are some writers, as I've said, John Updike wrote really about himself beautifully, and he wrote imaginatively about his own self, actually. And some of John Cheever's about his own self, and Hemingway's early stories, but they're very beautifully done, and so one doesn't really, I think, mind that. It's probably when the writing is very transparent and meager that there hasn't been the presentation of something aesthetically exciting and original. And perhaps that's what people would be more likely to object to.
Well, and I wanted to ask you both maybe a bit about how it is that you come up with the scenarios that you choose to write about. What does it feel like when you've seized on an idea and you think, yes, I can really write a whole book about this, or there's something there?
For me, I think it begins with a character. I have a character, someone that I meet that exists. I see her because mostly it's women character. I see her, I can feel her, she exists, she's here. I can even see her sometimes I'm wandering in the street and she's here in a cafe. I can see her and I can see how she dresses and how she sees the world and how sad she can feel. And so it's just the beginning, it's the meeting with a character. And I'm waiting for her, really waiting for her to come and to tell me where she's going. I love this story about Tolstoy. You know, Tolstoy, when he was writing Anna Karenine, he received some money from his publisher to finish Anna Karenine. And he didn't give the manuscript to the publisher. And the publisher was very angry about that. So he decided to take the train and to go to Yasnaya Polyana and to ask Tolstoy for the manuscript. And when he arrived and he said, okay, are you finished? And he said, no, Anna Karenina left and I'm waiting for her to come back. And it can seem like sort of a trick not to give the manuscript, but I can completely understand, even if, of course, I'm not comparing myself to Tolstoy. But the fact that you have a character and this character is really alive, and you're trying to live through him, to forget completely about yourself and just to get obsessed by this character. So for me, everything begins with the character.
Yes, I would definitely agree with that. With a character and with a special language, if you're kind of excited by the idea of formalism, of creating something that's a little different, a structure of a novel that's somewhat different. Some years ago, I was just looking at a book of history, I think of American history of the 20th century, and I saw this photograph of this young girl who was only 16 years old, and she had brown hair, and she was very sweet and pretty. She was not glamorous, and I looked at it was Norma Jean Baker, who we'd become Marilyn Monroe, and I felt such an excited kind of identification because she looked like a high school girl with whom I might have gone to school. She looked a little like my mother or her friends from that generation. And I thought, what would it have been like to be Norma Jean Baker, 16 years old, dropping out from high school. She got married very young, and a series of things happened to her. What would it be like to have been that girl who would then metamorphose into this most famous and iconic image of the 20th century, Marilyn Monroe? So I sort of became very galvanized by that image. If I had not seen that picture, I don't think I would ever have written about Marilyn Monroe.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I mean, Leïla, do you ever have moments of inspiration like that? Or like where it's an image or a feeling or something that you seize on? Or does it almost always come from within, these characters you're talking about?
No. For the nanny, for the Perfect Nanny, it was like that. I was very depressed and I was trying to find something to write about. And, you know, when you are a writer during the day, you don't work like other people work. You don't go to the office. And the afternoon for me was very gloomy and very sad. And I felt like very frustrated not to go to work. So I spent a lot of times in little parks in Paris. And I used to look and to observe very much all the nannies playing with children. And all those nannies from Africa, especially, and from Maghreb, playing with very blonde children with blue eyes and speaking to them. Those very big women speaking with Théodore and Marie. And I was like, wow, at the same time, it's very moving and it's very sad. She's going to teach him so many things and she's going to watch his first step and to take care of him when he's sick. And one day, those people are going to tell her, okay, we don't need you anymore. And I think that it's the fact that I spent so much time in those parks looking at those women that made me see them. You know, very often you are in the city and you are walking and you don't see people, and at one point you see them and you want to tell this story.
And you know, both of you have throughout your work considered both wholly imaginary characters and have written novels about real-life people. So in your case, Leïla, you've written about your family. And Joyce, I mean, we can talk about Norma, we can talk about anybody. And I wanted to ask, do you, as an artist, ask both of you, do you feel any kind of different moral responsibility or a different relationship to the facts when you're writing a fictional account of somebody who really lived? So when you were writing Blonde, how much fidelity did you feel you needed to maintain to her story to produce the novel?
Well, of course, with a work of fiction, usually you might begin with a disclaimer that this is a work of fiction. And if I'm writing about something that actually happened, I don't invent the major facts. I have to imagine the interiority that is brought to the facts. And writing about anything that really happened in history, probably most writers don't invent the facts. There's a sort of grid, we want to respect that. But if we're trying to imagine what it's like to have been in that place and that time and having some sort of emotional engagement, of course you do have to imagine that.
You know, I would say that maybe it's not very moral what I'm going to say, but I wrote about my family, but I'm very lucky because they are all dead. So it's easier to write about people who are dead. They are not going to ask you anything about what you wrote. And I would say that I don't know how to say in English, I have no pudeur, which means that I can say anything. And I have no shame. I don't feel ashamed when I work. When I write, I feel completely free. I never feel the sense of shame that I feel in life all the time. And my characters feel shame all the time. My publisher told me that the word that I use most is shame in my work. But myself, when I write, I don't feel that. So there's only my mother and my sisters who are alive, and they know me very well, and they know what I'm capable to do, and I think that they forgive me because I love them, and I write also with this love, so I think that I'm not going to harm them with what I write.
You know, Leïla, it's interesting because you're pointing to something that we also discussed while we were talking earlier, which is the ultimate freedom that you feel when you're writing as opposed to when you're existing kind of as Leïla in your day-to-day life. And Joyce, I remember reading an interview from a few years ago where you said something that really took me by surprise, which is, and I'm summarizing here, but you were saying, I don't feel as though I have a personality. Maybe I feel like I have a personality when I'm with my husband, or with my friends, or a small handful of people, but most of the time I feel totally transparent. And to me, these feel like very similar ideas. And I wondered what it was about that sort of, not quite like an abnegation of the self, but like how that figures into how you conceive of yourself as a writer, or how that absence of a conceived personality figures into how you write.
Well, William James, one of our most famous American philosophers, said that we have as many personalities as there are people who know us. The social self is largely a construct in terms of some context. During the pandemic and the lockdown, when many people were just alone, I think we all began to sort of see how the personality starts to corrode. You know, you don't really have a way of relating to a variety of other people if it's just you all alone. So there's some ontological doubt about whether the personality actually does exist. But I'm very interested in formal experimentation in literature. Characters and stories are the content, but I'm really excited by the idea of making up maybe a new language, a different kind of idiom, a different voice, telling a story in a slightly different way. To me, that's very exciting. The story itself is something that may be somewhat flexible, and we all have stories, but I think if you're a writer or any kind of an artist, you're sort of excited by the formal properties. Like my next novel, which is coming out in August, is called Babysitter, and it was trying to imagine a series of very intense scenes as in a movie where you're propelled forward, but you don't really know where you're going. So it's a historical present. So when I was writing in that mode, I was always sort of excited and a little bit stressed and tense, because there's something about life as it's unfolding in a kind of accelerated way. We really don't know where it's going. In contrast to, say, Tolstoy or Dostoevsky or many writers, their stories are essentially over with. Once upon a time there was, it's the past tense. So the whole story is over with, and there's a kind of sense of security that it's all over with. But in the historical present, which is what we're in right this minute, and I was on the New Jersey Turnpike, because things could so easily get much worse. You could be in a kind of flood. Almost anything can happen, we feel today. Like a tsunami of water could just come along and wash people away. But when you're in that historical present, you don't really know what's coming. And so for the writer, that's much more tense, a kind of experience.
Yeah, and for me, people always ask me how I write. Do I have a plan? Do I have a structure? But the truth is that I write completely in the dark. And the other day, I was with my daughter, who is 5, and my daughter is very afraid of the dark. So usually I go in her room, I read a story, and then she says, no, please, let the light, I'm very afraid. And the other day, I shut up the lights, and we were in the dark, and I said, okay, keep your eyes open. And you will see in like 2 or 3 minutes, you will be able to see your bed and the door, you'll see. And I felt that it was the perfect metaphor of my work. That it's exactly like this when I work. When you begin a novel, it's completely dark. But you try to keep your eyes open, and at the end, it's not so dark. You can see the shade of the bed and of the door. You don't understand everything, and I love that, because I think that's why I write, to tell people and to tell myself that we don't understand everything, and that we don't understand people, and that we don't understand ourselves, and that we die unknown, and that's how it is. But I thought that it was the metaphor. I write in the dark, and I think that fluidity is not always a good thing. I love the fact that you finish a sentence and you don't know what would be the next one, and it's always in the dark, and you're trying to go to the light.
What are the books that you've written that have surprised you the most? Is there a book where you think back on it and you say, I can't believe I ended up there, but of course it was the only option?
Well, I actually write a little differently from Leïla. I'm more like, if we divide writers into 2 different camps, there's D.H. Lawrence, who write very, very spontaneously and with white heat. And James Joyce, where it's pretty much planned, and James Joyce could spend 10 years on a novel because the outline and everything is kind of ready there for him to imagine every day. That's the kind of writer that I am. I do know where I'm going. I have a beginning, I have a title, I have an ending, so it's a kind of architectural triangle. And then I go through the scenes. I don't know the sentences. I don't know second by second. But it's like you say, well, I'm going to travel to San Francisco. So there are different ways that you can get there, but you do know your destination. You don't wind up in Nome, Alaska. You know, it would be very, very crazy and wayward and that psychologically, I think, destabilizing. So I couldn't write the way Leïla writes. I have to do a lot of thinking first and plotting in my head before I start writing it all, because it would just take so long.
No, I think for all my books I finished in Alaska. Even I was thinking I was going to San Francisco, but I've never arrived in San Francisco.
What is your favorite part of the writing process? Because we hear a lot of writers who say that writing is terrible, writing is awful. I can't believe I'm doing this. The only reason I'm doing it is because I have to, from some part of me. But is there a part of the process that you reliably enjoy?
Yeah, I enjoy writing. I enjoy being alone with my characters and writing. Some days are not so good, some days are not so productive, but the days that are the best days of my life. I was so happy, the days where really the characters exist. And especially when at the end of the day, you read what you wrote and you're like, what? How did it happen? How did I have this idea? There is something quite magical. I love to be very focused. The fact that you forget everything that exists outside, and that you are so focused that you begin at 10, and when you look at your watch, it's like 7. And the whole day passed, and the characters fell in love, they had children, and they traveled, and so many things happened. And I love also when a character is, rebelling against you, and a character doesn't want you to do what you want him to do, and he's doing something else, and you're like, okay, you want to do that, let's try. And you do it, and the character usually is right, and he's doing what he has to do. So I love also the surprise. There are a lot of surprises also when you write. I love writing. Even if, of course, I suffer very much as a writer, but not so much.
Well, I think most writers enjoy revision, because the revision is the sense that you've already finished the manuscript, and so now you're going over the terrain, but much more rapidly. For me, the first draft, even though I do a lot of thinking, I like to run. I run and walk a lot every day. And when I'm running, I'm trying to sort of see little cinematic scenes of novel, if I'm working on a novel, and then come back home and take notes. But when I finally have a manuscript, it's like having hacked a way through with a machete through the underbrush. You know, it's very difficult, and you have a kind of crude path. So you've gotten to the end. But then the next time you go over the path, maybe you're in an airplane, like you're going really fast, and you can see the terrain, and you know the ending, and the ending is there, you know the title, and now you just have to fix up a few of the brambles and the underbrush between yourself and the ending. So I feel very exhilarated and very excited, but I don't feel that way about the first draft, no.
And what do you do in those moments when you have some kind of creative obstacle or block?
I drink, to be really honest. And I eat onion rings a lot. I don't know why. I smoke
There's
too
some
much.
property in onions, I
And
think.
I used to cry. I used to call my husband and cry. And now he doesn't even answer. He's like, oh, you're crying. I don't care. I know about this kind of thing. I used to say, oh, I'm a mess. I will never write again. My career is ended. And now he's like, okay, I'm not interested in that. So he hangs up.
Well, if I have a difficult time, I do, as I said, I like to run. So I live out in a quasi-country at the edge of the suburban Princeton area. It's in Hopewell Township. So I can run in 5 minutes and be on a country road, and there are sheep and there's some chickens, like the little farms and so forth. So I'm in a completely different world. And I sort of feel there's a hill near my house called Bayberry Hill. I feel that over the years I run up Bayberry Hill, and at the top of the hill there will be awaiting for me some sort of solution or some little hint of something to do. And that's happened so many times that I have faith in that.
But do you have less anxiety now than before? Do you know now that you will find a solution, or do you still have the same kind of anxiety as 10 years before, 10 years ago, or 20 years ago?
That depends on the project. Some projects are very difficult. When I wrote Blonde, that was the most difficult novel that I'd ever written because it has a lot of formal experimentation in it. And I actually was having little heart palpitations, and I've never had that before or since. But then I've written other novels that are in first person, that are more they seem like the confessional or memoirist, or not really, but they have that kind of idiomatic, colloquial ease that you can get with first person. And those are relatively easy to write. So I tell my writing students, if you want to write and enjoy it, write in the first person. Because immediately readers identify, it's very accessible. It doesn't have to be memoirist, really, but it has that tone.
Do you find that to be true for you, Leïla, as well, that first person comes to you?
I never wrote a book at the first person, and now I'm thinking for the third one of the trilogy, I'm thinking of doing it, and I don't know why, but I'm very afraid of that. There are two things I'm afraid of: writing in the present and writing with the first person. I think it's very, I don't know why, I think for me it's very, very difficult. I love the idea, and I don't even have a sort of narrator. I'm inside the character. I'm in his intimacy directly. This is not a narrator who is telling a story. You are inside every character, and from the point of view of the character, you will see the scene, and then you will go to the point of view of another character. So that's the way I've been writing, but I think it could change.
Maybe who knows? Who knows what kind of, maybe you can write faster, you won't have to call your husband or eat onion rings, we don't know.
Maybe I will begin to run also now. It gives me, the will to run. I think I will run.
Or just walking. New York City is such a great place for walking. All my writer friends and poet friends who live in cities, they just walk and walk and walk. And while they're walking, they're turning over phrases in their heads.
I wanted to ask something, because it seems to me that both of you you're not afraid of going to situations or characters who live out very dark impulses, right? I mean, certainly this is true for Babysitter, your upcoming novel, Joyce, but it's true for a lot of your work that it conjures up some really difficult and unpleasant and kind of almost depraved scenarios. And certainly, Leïla, for you too, we're sort of going into the deepest crevices of human nature, right? And so I thought I'd ask a very light question, which is how do you prevent yourself from becoming overwhelmed or full of despair? Or what's the balance for that when you're living in such dark worlds of your own making?
I was raised by two women, my grandmother and my mother, who had a very dark imagination. My grandmother would tell us very dark tales, and we were very frightened, and at the same time, I was very excited, and all the time we would ask her, tell us more, and it was just about young girls who were killed and who were kidnapped and all this. And my mother was someone who was very anxious. She was always afraid that something could happen to us. So she would explain to us all the dangers of life. And I think I was like 6 or 7, and I understood that I could be kidnapped and die, and that I could be raped, and that the outside was dangerous. When I would tell my mother that I have a headache, she would say, okay, you're having a brain tumor, I'm sure that you're going to die. So I think that very young I figured all the darkness and all the danger. And it was not that I was afraid, I was fascinated by that. And I saw my mother, who lived all her life in fear and in nightmares, And I thought that maybe if I write about my nightmares, I'm not going to be so afraid. And maybe I'm going to deliver myself from all these nightmares. So I have always this idea to give my nightmares to you, so I can free myself from my nightmares.
Well, I think it's a question that is not usually put, say, to male writers. It's more like women writers maybe in some way expected to write differently. But, you know, the greatest work throughout history, whether it's Aeschylus or Sophocles or Homer, or, as I said before, Shakespeare's tragedies or Moby Dick and the work of Hemingway, it's just understood that serious writers take on subjects that may be tragic, they may use the word depraved. And I was thinking, Chekhov didn't think anything was depraved. He thought anything that's human is somehow the subject that we can write about. And of course, Chekhov was also a physician, so he didn't feel there was anything that was, in a way, outside nature. You know, there's nothing that's supernatural. So I always wanted to write about subjects that are holding a mirror up to reality. And not all my writing is really that dark. I do have some humor and some comedy. There's always a strong reservoir of human contact and connection and love. It's like a thread that goes through my writing, that the connection that keeps the people, gives meaning to their lives is some connection with other people. But they may inhabit a world that is violent. At the same time, they're not necessarily broken or devastated by it. They persevere and they come through. So we may begin characters who are somewhat immature or incomplete, but I'd like to pursue a character through maturity and maybe having experiences that are painful and then becoming more complex instead of rising to another level of personality.
What moves you most in works of literature? Are there commonalities between the books that can move you again and again?
What moves me the most, I think you just talk about Chekhov, and Chekhov is probably one of my favorite writers because there is a certain tenderness, and at the same time there is a certain despair, but I think he believes that you can save any character, there's a light in him. There is something, I love his plays and I love his short stories. I think he's one of the most human and most tender writers that have ever existed. So I think that's what's moving me, the humanity. The fact that he doesn't judge his character. He accepts them exactly as they are, and he always tries to find the light, to find something that will give us the opportunity as reader to identify to them, even if they are bad people or lazy people or ordinary people. But at the end, we feel, okay, we are the same. I share something with him. I share a condition with him. The fact that we are going to go through the same journey. And I think that is what is moving me the most.
Yes, Chekhov is a brilliant portraiture of a realism of people who are not extraordinary, who are not monsters, are not unusually heroic. They're sort of like real people with many flaws. So if you read Chekhov in contrast to Dostoevsky, for instance, you see it's like totally different approaches to literature, just on the level of sentences and presentation of scenes. Dostoevsky is a great artist of people in febrile, feverish interior scenes, usually 1, 2, or 3 people who are in very intense relationships. He has almost no interest in nature. You never see a sky, you never see anything beyond a tree. You know, in contrast, say, to Tolstoy, who could actually do just about everything. He was a great master of the drawing room and the world of nature. He wrote so beautifully about just skies and war and peace, and ballrooms and deathbeds and young soldiers. Tolstoy could do everything. Dostoevsky could do very few things, but he was a great writer. And I think it's so interesting because to be a great artist, it doesn't mean that you try to do everything, because you only do what you can do. And Jackson Pollock could do what he did very well, and Jasper Johns what he did, and Edward Hopper did something very different, and Georgia O'Keeffe. Each of these great writers, great artists, did what they could do, but they couldn't have done other things. So they developed their great strengths. I think that I have a predilection for the Chekhovian tenderness, the sort of domestic realism. So I do experiment with melodrama and with a sort of Dostoevskian exaggeration and hyperbole, which is sort of another genre. As I said before, I like to experiment with literary forms and try different things. I don't always do the same thing. John Updike was a writer whom I admired very much, but John always did the same kind of thing. It was domestic realism, and often within a family. That was his turf. He did that very well. Cormac McCarthy, on the contrary, would never be caught dead in a domestic situation, you know. He doesn't write about babies and adultery. Cormac McCarthy takes as his subject this sort of vastness that is tragedy and the outdoors and nature, and a kind of almost heroic biblical vision that's very much in contrast with the domestic realists.
Listening to you talk about this sort of, you know, it's an arrangement like a genus and species practically, but I'm wondering, for both of you, is there an emotional register or a domain or an idea that you haven't yet explored in your fiction that interests you and that you'd like to try?
I would like to write a play. I'm very interested in theater, and I think I would love that. I tried to, and I think it's very difficult. The thing is, I'm very bad at dialogues. I remember when I sent my first manuscript to my publisher, he said the book is good, but the dialogues are terrible. And so I decided not to write dialogues anymore. So very often people ask, I don't understand why your characters are not speaking with each other and there are so few dialogues. And I'm like, okay, because I'm very bad at dialogues, that's why I don't write them. And now I'm trying to improve in that field, and I think that's something I would really love to write. It's a play, and in France right now, nowadays, we have very interesting things are happening in terms of theater, so it's something that I would like to explore, but maybe no one will ever want to put my dialogues on the stage. I don't know.
Well, I have written plays. It's very wonderful collaborative work, and you'll discover if you write, say, a one-act play, the first thing you do is you don't necessarily send it to your editor. You take it to some actors, and the actors will do a reading, and you will immediately see if the dialogue is a little too stiff or formal. It's theater is living, and it has to convince on its most immediate level. So you don't have any refuge in the narration, like you don't have your own voice. But the people will be speaking, and you may have a real gift for dialogue that will blossom when you're in the theater. But you can't really write a play all by yourself without collaborating with other people.
It's something to look forward to. I want to be mindful of everybody's time because we've been here for a little bit, but I also wanted to make sure that there was an opportunity for anybody in the audience to ask a question. I don't know if anybody's thought of anything, but yes. Oh, hang on, we'll give you a microphone.
Hi. Ooh. Oh, now I'm in the spotlight. The pandemic has impacted our lives in so many deep and provocative ways. We're changed people. How are you reflecting on that, and how is that impacting your creative process and your vision for your writing?
I have to say, if I want to be really honest, that it didn't change a lot of things in my life, because my life is about writing, staying at home and not talking to so many people and being alone. So it was a very great excuse to have the life I always wanted to have. So yeah, for me actually, and I'm really sorry to say that, maybe it's not very politically correct, but it was great. I've never worked as during the pandemic, and I didn't really miss people. I didn't miss traveling because my life is not really about that. And I had 2 manuscripts to finish, and I finished them, and I had another idea, and I began to write something else. So for me, actually, it was great, even if, of course, I understand how much it was disturbing for other people. But I think that my life is about discipline. It's about saying no. No, I can't go out. No, I can't go to the cinema. No, I can't go have a drink. So it was perfect for me, the best excuse to say no.
Well, my experience was probably not representative because the great existential or ontological reality of my life is that I do live alone. And it's because my husband passed away in 2019. So that was the great dilemma of my life, that I was alone. So the pandemic did not intensify that, really. So it's hard even to talk about that, because people who've had great losses in their lives are so kind of shaken and lose their footing. So that's something from the outside that comes along, but while it's very upsetting and tragic, it can't somehow, it doesn't matter as much as what has happened to you. I mean, we all know this. Say you have an illness you have a terminal illness or some sort of chronic condition, that's sort of in the foreground of your life. And so if there's a horrible administration in Washington, as there was for 4 years, that's pretty awful, but it's sort of in the background. The only radical change in my life is that I was teaching. So I was leaving the house, and I was teaching at both Rutgers and Princeton. So I was going out and meeting with students. And then in March 2020, the universities shut down. And so we all went back home, and we started teaching on Zoom. So I went from being a person who, though I was very lonely at home, I was out in the world quite a bit, and I would come back home. But then with the pandemic, I was just sort of in my house. And I could go walking and running outside, and with just a few people. But much of my life just came to a halt. And of course, my writing was not terribly affected, because that's what I did anyway. But you can't have a life that's only writing. And you have children, and you have a husband. And so when you speak of being alone, you have anchors and meaning in your life. And so even though you feel that you're alone with your writing, it's bracketed by a kind of security that people who really live alone don't have.
Any more questions for anybody? Well, maybe before, oh, yes.
Hi, I'd be interested to ask both of you, do you feel that the impulse for creative writing is sort of innate and something that's been with you throughout your entire life, or has it really been a practice and something that's been driven through, the building of a routine over time, or do you really feel like it's been a part of you since the time that you first learned to write, and that this is a core piece of your identity?
The impulse for freedom, I think my mother could answer this question better than me. I was told that, there is a story that my parents always told me when I was very young. I had a very strict education, and my father was like a Moroccan patriarch, Muslim father, and you wouldn't answer my father, and he had a voice like this. And everyone was very afraid of him. And one day he was very angry against me, and he screamed at me. And I think I answered, and I said something. And he said, "You don't answer to your father." And I said, "It's my mouth, and I say whatever I want." And then my family called me "It's my mouth," so "C'est ma bouche" in French, for years. And now my nickname is still "C'est ma bouche." And I've always been like that, and I think that's something that's fascinating, that fascinates me. I've always been fascinated by the fact why in a family one individual will have this impulse for freedom. Why someone in a society, in a group, will have the will, the desire to just live his own life, and will be also the courage, will be brave enough to say, okay, that's not what I want to be myself and to do whatever I want. I think there's a mystery with freedom that keeps fascinating me, and I want to write also about that. Why? You know, I have so many friends in Morocco who had very strict education like me. Some of them was destroyed by that. Some of them became very conformist. And some of them decided one day, okay, I don't know, I'm a homosexual and I don't really care about what you think, I'm gonna live my life. And even if it was very hard, and even if they had to sacrifice a lot of things, they did that. Why this one and not this one? And it's a mystery, I don't have the answer, but that's something I think I'm always going to write about, because it's a great mystery. I don't know why.
Yes, I think in answer to your question, I think it's very natural. It's an inborn instinct in our species to tell stories, to invent all sorts of wild mythologies, you know, holy books and religions and all sorts of astonishing things, all springing out of the human imagination. So what's a little different about the writer or the artist is that these people become apprentices, in a sense, to the craft and the history and tradition of their work. It isn't just telling stories or sort of mouthing off, you know, to your parents. That's maybe the one little overt action, but taking time to read and learn the history of your craft and experimenting with language and revising and working hard, you know, working, as you said, like all day long. The fact that you're willing to do that, and writers, we are people who postpone gratification sometimes for years. Many people have to have a gratification satisfied like within an hour, you know. They can't invest time in something that may pay off or may not pay off. Writing a novel could involve years of your life and it may never be published, you know. You're taking an enormous risk. So I think that the ideal personality of the writer and artist is actually masochism.
Anybody have any further questions about that? We probably have time for one last question from the audience if somebody has one. Anybody? Well, we can end on masochism, but maybe, maybe that's the way to do it. Let's see. Yeah, why don't we wrap there? I'm sure Leïla and Joyce will be around in the atrium afterwards if you wanted to speak with them. But in the meantime, I wanted to thank everybody for coming tonight, and especially thank you to Joyce and to Leïla for their time and insight. It was such a fascinating conversation.
And thank you for staying. I really didn't think anyone would be here at all.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Selection of Leïla and Joyce books are available in the Marble Room if you want to buy a copy and have it signed. But really, thank you very much. I believe we all felt welcomed in this conversation, the way we feel welcome in your books. So thank you for your generosity and for tonight. Thank you very much.